We are so glad to be with you this evening. My name is Judith Silverman Hodara from Fortuna Admissions. I am joined by an amazing group of individuals, Joanna Graham, also from Fortuna, Bill Kooser from Fortuna, and Bryce Warwick of Warwick Strategies. And wanted to introduce you to everyone and also give you an opportunity to understand a little bit about our backgrounds. I have pretty much my entire experience is in admissions and in counseling, coming from Wharton. Joanna is with us as an expert coach and has also been a former director of GMAC. Bill is a Fortuna director with us as well and is the former associate dean at Chicago Booth. And Bryce Warwick, who is a wonderful partner of ours, is the president of Warwick Strategies. What we'd like to do tonight is really give you an opportunity to think about the different exams that you're going to be considering and understanding that as you go through the process, there's a lot to keep in mind. And I thought what I would do is kind of kick off with a slide showing the differences between the different between the different exams, giving you an opportunity to sort of understand the differences between the timing and the scoring and the sections. And then we can talk a little bit more in depth about each of them. So Bryce, if you don't mind kicking us off, if you could share with us from your perspective, some of the main features of the GMAT. And then I'm gonna ask Joanna to weigh in as well, and Bill on different parts of this slide in front of you.
Yeah, so on the GMAT, you have it divided into 4 pieces. The 2 primary pieces are your quant and your verbal sections. Within the quant section, it's divided into 2 pieces as well, and that's problem solving and data sufficiency. Within the verbal, you have reading comp, critical reasoning, and sentence correction. And those 2 are what you're primarily going to hear about when you're talking about scores, because that's on the 200 to 800 scale. There are 2 other pieces that are scored individually, which are an essay and an integrated reasoning section. And that integrated reasoning section is primarily a secondary test of quant and critical reasoning skills.
And would you say, you had mentioned to me earlier, Bryce, I'm sorry, that there was something about the timing?
Yeah, so about 18 months ago, GMAC, in an attempt to shorten up the test a little bit, and maybe in response to competitive pressures from the GRE, the quant section dropped from 75 minutes to 62 minutes, and the verbal section dropped from 75 minutes to 65 minutes. So it's a little shorter than it was before, and the questions that were taken out in order to make that work were all experimental or data collection questions, so theoretically the composition of the test didn't change.
And Joanna, do you mind weighing in a little bit on the GRE? And I know that you've had exposure across the board to all the different exams through your work. Would you mind sort of talking a little bit about the GRE and maybe the kind of clients that you've seen that really, are using the GRE, might choose it instead of the GMAT, maybe just, kind of the nuts and bolts?
Sure, of course. And, in the GRE, similar to the, in some ways similar to the GMAT, has undergone some refreshes over the years, although I think it's most, the more significant refresh happened a few years with the changing of the score scale and really some pretty significant moves by ETS to make the exam a little bit more customer friendly. And you'll find that some of the changes I think that GMAC has really introduced over the last few years, honestly, have really been driven by changes that ETS has made. GRE has done some things with the new version of the GRE that we rolled out a few years ago. I don't know if we would necessarily call it new at this point anymore. They gave candidates the ability to use a calculator. They gave candidates the ability to go back to flag questions. Things that really, I think, have, when you think about just sort of the way that exams are built and the anxiety that a lot of people have about these exams, really just things that are, that were designed to make, to set up candidates to do their very best work. So from a structure perspective, I mean, I think that there definitely are some merits to some of the things that the DTS has rolled out in recent years to really make the exam a little bit more candidate friendly. And you'll see that GMAC has done some interesting things as well too to sort of follow suit. But I think, really from a content perspective and a level of difficulty, the GRE is just that. It's a general assessment, whereas the GMAT has been around, for 50 plus years, and has always been designed by business schools for business school admissions. And so, there are, I would say, the biggest difference, at least what I've seen, it really has to do with the quant. And I think that, oftentimes you'll find candidates who are maybe a little weaker on the quant side, and find that the GRE might be a better fit for their skill set. It allows them to really show off the best version of themselves. But I do tell clients that it's important to realize that you're playing in a much broader pool when you are taking the GRE, and that it's not a secret that the GRE quant is a bit easier and less rigorous than the GMAT quant. And so I think it's really important to think about your background, your strengths and weaknesses, if you are weighing GMAT versus GRE, and which is going to put you in the best light. There are some candidates, and we can certainly dive into this a little bit later into the webinar, I think, for whom the GRE is a very strong fit. But I think it is just, at a higher level, the quant section is not quite as rigorous. And so if quant is not necessarily your thing, the GRE may be a stronger fit for you right off the bat to help sort of showcase the skills that you do have.
Thank you so much. And Bill, in your experiences as a director of admissions at Booth, I know that you've had a lot of exposure to the EA, executive assessment. Would you mind weighing in and kind of walking us through the nuts and bolts of the executive assessment?
Sure, Judith.
And really, who might be a good fit for that exam?
Right. Well, the thing to remember is that the EA was created by GMAC in conjunction with several schools, including Chicago Booth, as an exam for executive MBA students. Mm-hmm. And that was the original design. Now, schools came to GMAC and said, we'd like to get some additional assessment on our candidates for our executive MBA program, but so many of them, they haven't been in school for 15 years. They're really nervous about the GMAT. So the executive assessment was designed as a, for lack of a better term, cut down version of the GMAT, to make it a little less onerous in terms of preparation time, to make it a little bit more focused on issues and concepts that executive MBA students were going to need. So as you see, it does have a quant and verbal section, very similar to the GMAT. Many of the questions would be the same, also has an integrated reasoning component. The exam is only an hour and 30 minutes. And again, the initial idea and the way many schools are promoting it is, you really don't need to spend a lot of time doing the GMAT prep, spending months trying to get prepared for it. Although, as you might expect, students are and candidates are very, very interested in getting as much preparation as they possibly can. So my guess is that over time, as the EA becomes more well known around the industry, that people will end up doing the same kind of things they've been doing now for GMAT for many years. It's still largely focused on executive MBA programs.
Okay, that was my next question.
We've heard of, I think Judith, you and I have heard of one school that may be allowing it now for their full-time MBA program. I don't know of any others, have not heard of any others yet. So it's still primarily there for executive MBA students. And one of the other things to recognize is that the EA is used in a different way than the GMAT would be in a full-time program. So EA in an executive MBA program, or the GMAT in the executive MBA program, is really designed as can the candidate meet the minimum requirements, particularly on the quant side, and not so much how high can the score go. Right. So it's not really, I'm looking for a 750, 780, 790 score, but rather simply, do they have sufficient quantitative ability to get through the program?
And thank you so much. I mean, I think this chart is actually great. And for those of you that are watching, we will be posting this on our websites, so you can really kind of, look at this. And I think it's terrific just to sort of see them in comparison with one another. What we really wanted to spend some of the time on tonight is something that I alluded to a little bit earlier, Joanna, with, who is a good candidate for the GRE. Bryce, do you mind telling us, in your experiences, as in your role as someone that teaches both and supports on both, what you're seeing as far as candidates and their comfort level with either the GMAT or the GRE, and why there might be a differentiation. And then I'm going to ask Joanna and Bill to weigh in with their experiences as coaches and within the industry from a different perspective, what they might see as well.
Yeah, I think you really have to look at the differences first as a starting place, and understand how that's going to impact that decision. Primary differences would be being able to use a calculator on the GRE, which if your mental math skills aren't as sharp, that's going to be an issue. Another big issue is the adaptivity of the test. So on the GRE, you're taking an entire section, and that section is the basis for the difficulty of the second section that you're going to face in both quant and verbal, whereas the GMAT is adaptive on a question-by-question basis. So another thing that results in is on the GRE, you can go back within a section and review and flag and check those answers. Whereas on the GMAT, once you've submitted an answer, it's done. So a lot of what that leads to, and I guess the other thing to mention is, as far as the math goes, the math level of the GRE and the GMAT are extremely similar. Really pressed me on it. I might even say there's a tiny bit more math on the GRE than the GMAT. But when you talk about the level of critical thinking that's involved in the math questions, that's what elevates the GMAT several levels above what's on the GRE. Whereas the GRE is a lot more straightforward, sort of here's the question, do you know how to answer it or not? The GMAT's gonna tuck that into a few layers that you have to go through. So a lot of times when I'm looking at students, that's one of the things I'm looking at, is if you have that base level of comfort, am I looking at someone who's really good with making strategic decisions about, even if I'm not sure how to make an answer, can I think about other strategies for solving this question that the GRE or that the GMAT's really going to reward, whereas the GRE is going to have more of a one path situation. And then on the verbal side, one thing that you have to consider is that the GRE has a ton of vocab, and you have to be willing to commit yourself to doing a lot of memorization on that vocab, because there's just no other way around it. The corollary on the GMAT is sentence correction, which native speakers can often get by a little bit more easily, maybe not excel at, but do at a more passable level. So a lot of times I'm evaluating those types of skills, the strategic thinking, the comfort level with the math and with being challenged on that critical thinking side of the math, and then what might be easier in terms of the verbal components that are different. The reading comp and logical or critical reasoning are for the most part the same, although the GMAT has quite a bit more critical reasoning than the GRE.
So Bill, in your experiences at Booth, what were you seeing? Did you see a type of student or a background of a student that was just more comfortable and adept at one exam over the other?
Typically what we would have seen is that students who were considering business school among other options, so PhD program in economics or studying of some other social science, if they hadn't decided on which direction they wanted to go, oftentimes they take the GRE because it could be applied to either kind of program. We also saw students who came out of less technical backgrounds thinking the GRE was going to be easier, and in terms of the math in particular, and they would often take the GRE rather than the GMAT. But in terms of overall quality of students, once they got into the program, no difference whatsoever. Just kind of basically, thinking through what the best option for each individual candidate was. And we as the school didn't really care too much. Still, vast majority took the GMAT, but a good GRE score was recognized as a good score.
So Joanna, in your role at GMAC, did you get asked how could, I'm a student, how do I decide? Did you sort of say, well, baselines, or, if you're kind of leaning this way, this is what I would do? How did you sort of guide students in that decision?
So when I was at GMAC, my last year at GMAC, I spent a good bit of time on the road, and spoke at a lot of events where I was often going head to head with a representative from ETS. And I think GMAC always, we were very good as an organization about not really, I don't want to say speaking ill of the competition, but really, you want to own your product essentially,
Right,
and
of
so I'm
course.
not going to convince you that my product is a better product by telling you everything that I believe is wrong with another product. I really, genuinely believed, and my background is in curriculum development. I've been working in the test prep space and writing curriculum for standardized assessments for over 15 years. And so I've taken the GMAT several times. I've taken the GRE several times. I feel that I know both exams well. But at the end of the day, when I would talk to candidates, I would talk to them a little bit more about what I thought, the merits of the GMAT were. And I'll be honest, even though I've since left GMAC, I do genuinely feel that the GMAT for business school, for most candidates, does tend to be the stronger fit. And GMAC has years of validity studies showing to the correlation, a pretty strong correlation between performance on the GMAT and success in a business program, in a competitive program. But all that being said, especially when the GRE, I think, first came out, schools were kind of looking at it, and I think some schools and some students kind of looked at it as a little bit of a side door, like a trap door into some classes, because it wasn't something that was being asked or reported when it came to the rankings.
Right.
And so for business schools, and I look actually a lot at, the law school space and the business school space is sort of a, two very separate case studies in diversification of applicant pools. One's, I think, a little bit better than the other, and you can kind of guess who won which side. But I think for business schools really took a look and said, we want to diversify our applicant pools. And that was really the impetus for many schools to start widely accepting the GRE. It added more people of color. It added, more women and more non-traditional, business majors and folks who had a stronger liberal arts background. I do think at the end of the day, I'm sure Bill and Judith, you could probably, attest to this, that, at the end of the day, that's, there's a lot of strength that that type of diversity brings to the classroom, and it's something that, can't always be easily quantified. So for candidates, I think there were, when I would provide kind of counsel on this, that really it came down to, you need to find something that plays to your strength. Your strengths. And so pick the assessment. I would typically, ask candidates, especially if they're early in the process, to take a practice exam, for both tests and to see how they fared. If they had a chance, and especially if they didn't have a particularly strong quant background, I do tend to encourage folks, if they can score reasonably well on the GMAT quant section, and by reasonably well, for your top 10 schools, that really means like a 47 or higher, but really, quite honestly, probably like a 49 or a 50. But if you can score reasonably well in the quant, it's worth the time to invest in GMAT preparation, because it really shows a school that you have those quantitative skills and capabilities to do well in a program.
Well, thank you so much. I am learning so much tonight from you all. I'm really so happy to be on this call. And I think we just talked a little bit about this. Do MBA programs have a preference? Bill, can you just sort of restate what you said a little bit earlier?
Well, I think a good score is a good score. That being said, I think most admissions officers still understand the GMAT better than they understand the GRE. And the GMAT is still the score that's typically mentioned in any rankings, and it's what faculty members will ask about.
Sure.
So I think if you really got deep down, admissions people would rather see GMAT scores. Just because they know them better, they can talk to their faculties, hey, our average GMAT score is whatever it might be. On the other hand, they recognize that they can expand diversity, they can get a different pool of candidates by accepting the GRE, and recognizing that a good GRE score is a good score. And that will, there won't be a preference in the admissions process, in the evaluation process, one score versus another, although they might be more familiar with the GMAT.
And I think that's something that I know that students that I work with ask me a lot, does it matter to schools, or what are schools going to, quote, think, regardless of the score? Do they read into it? Oh, I'm not as strong in XYZ, so I'm going to take this exam or that exam. And I think what you said was really important. A good score is a good score. So thank you for that. And Bill, we talked a little bit earlier also about the EA, and programmatically, that there are not a lot of full-time programs that are looking at the EA as of now. Correct?
As of now. And again, that might change over time as, again, schools, the EA is very, very new within the last 5-6 years. So as schools become more familiar with it through their executive MBA programs, many may decide, you know, we have a good sense of what this exam is all about and how we can evaluate students through it. And you may see more full-time MBA programs taking it on.
So Bryce, do you have students that are taking more than one exam that you're working with right now or have worked with in the past?
Typically not concurrently, but I have plenty of students who have made a switch at some point along the process because they've decided that there's a better fit with what they started with versus what else is available. And I think it links back to a conversation that we were just having when you're talking about, well, a good score is a good score. The question is, well, how are those being evaluated?
Right.
Because if you go straight off the percentiles, you take someone with, you know, the same skill level, the percentile on GRE Quant is going to be higher than on GMAT Quant, probably significantly higher. And the percentile score on GMAT Verbal is going to be a little higher than it would be on GRE Verbal if you take someone of the skill level. So often you'll get people who will run up to a point in their process and they'll say, you know what, I can't get this magic number, whatever it is, 80th percentile in quant or whatever that number might be on the GMAT, and that might be a reason that they switch over to the GRE. Or they might say, you know, I'm totally stuck on the timing on one of the tests, and I just need to try something different. So this is something where I think it really pays to get some quality advice early in the process and to make a decision, because while about 70% of the skills are transferable test to test, there can be a significant amount of time that you can lose if you're devoting that to one test over another.
And I would agree with that. I mean, I think that sometimes students will come to us for you know, application advice and support, and they're sort of like on the fence, like they've taken both. They're not exactly, you know, they think they're going to take one of them again. They're trying to figure out, you know, the best way to present it and to angle it. And I frequently will tell them, like, you need to give yourself enough time really to have experienced both. So if you're applying in a certain round, like round one, you want to back that up by a number of months to give yourself the opportunity to have the exposure. Because for most students, they haven't been in a testing environment since they were 18 or 19, 17 or 18, right, for college, even a little younger. And you kind of don't remember, you know, what it's going to take to get you to that point, and also what it's like to study for exams when you're also working full-time. Or involved in other things. So I think that's also a piece of the puzzle, is sort of the time management for how am I going to get this all done in a fairly, you know, when I've got other responsibilities and I'm not going to high school and then coming home and studying for 4 hours. So this, Joanna, I know that you've had some students that you've talked to and counseled about switching exams in your experience, and I'm assuming that Bryce has as well. But Joanna, can you maybe talk a little bit about this concept about switching, and how maybe you've given advice about that?
So I think that it really depends on where the candidate is in the process. And this is always and I think this is a good reminder to any applicant, that the GMAT or the GRE or the EA is just one piece of your application. And so when I have these conversations with people, you know, I want to do a little more probing at first, because I want to find out, you know, have you identified who's going to be writing your letters of recommendation? Have you started thinking through what your narrative is going to be? You know, how much work have you done on your resume? And quite honestly, you know, is it November 20th and you're targeting a January 6th deadline, or, you know, or is it March and you're still thinking about round one? And so if your runway is significantly longer, you know, and once I ask, you know, a couple more probing questions about, you know, background and quantitative, you know, experience and skills and things like that, you know, and we can, I think we can come to a reasonable decision together. But honestly, the first thing that I ask folks is really to think about the bigger picture. And that is just a gentle reminder that, at the end of the day, these assessments are just one piece of your application. And even a 780 on the GMAT, or even a 170 across the board on the GRE, is not going to help you at HBS if your resume, if your essays, if your letters of recommendation don't help to back that up or validate that score. It's just one data point.
And I wanted to talk about this a little bit. I think it's a really interesting question, but it's somehow like students kind of sometimes feel like there's a magic number, which then means that the GMAT is the holy grail. And if I get that magic number on the GRE or the EA, that means I'm capable of the GMAT. Bryce, have you had applicants that have asked you this question? Have talked about this with you? Is there a sense that like the GRE is something that they're kind of starting out with and they ultimately want to graduate to the GMAT? I don't know what your experience has been with this.
Yeah, I think that perception exists that it's sort of a secondary exam. And I think most people that if they felt like they could do well on the GMAT, they would prefer to do that because that's one question that doesn't need to be answered about their application. But the one thing I always try and stress is these scores are a means to an end. Mm-hmm. And if you're not going to significantly change the decision that's going to be made, don't invest a whole lot of time and a whole lot of money into, making a score that's slightly different or taking a slightly different test. It's probably worth putting more time into the other areas of your application where you have a chance to make a difference.
Bill, when you talk with students and you counsel them, and I know that you've seen them, both as an advisor now
right.
with Fortuna,
right.
and then as an admissions director, what do you generally point them towards? Both on the public side, on the private side. There's so many resources available. Can you tell us a little bit about what you suggest they think about and look at?
I think lost you there, Judith. There are all sorts of resources out there. Many things online, practice tests, GMAC and ETS have wonderful preparation programs. Some schools also will provide introductions to the various exams. So for example, Booth does have a little introduction to the EA and help you figure out whether that's an appropriate exam for you and whether and how to prepare for it appropriately. So I would very much start with the sources of the assessments themselves and kind of go to their websites, get the basic information, get a familiarity with the exams, and then begin to talk to a professional to get some advice, whether that's someone like Bryce or someone like us at Fortuna, to kind of walk through what really makes sense given the person's background, given the person's quant ability and verbal ability, what they've done in standardized testing in the past, and then together developing a strategy for how best to utilize all those resources and whether or not a full-blown prep class is required or appropriate. So there's so much out there that students can get very far along with an understanding of the assessments on their own, but I think having a little bit of expert guidance is always useful.
So Bryce, this is a related question, which is not on the screen. Do students come to you with their GRE or their with their ACT or the SAT scores and say, so this is what I did 5 years ago, and this is kind of what I believe I'm capable of? Do you kind of counsel them at all on scores that they got when they were 17 or 16?
I hear that a lot, usually as a justification for why I think I can get a 99th percentile score. Without maybe recognition that the pool that you're competing against has changed a little bit. But the other thing that I always try and bring up is, are you the same person you were when you were taking your SAT? Because a lot of times we get the reverse. We get someone who really struggled through that part of standardized testing, and they come to me and say, hey, I'm not good at standardized tests. And I think that's a misconception that you have to correct right away. You weren't good at standardized tests. That doesn't mean that you can't be now. And as far as availability of resources, there's really the whole range. You can go from self-study, and there are so many materials out there that there's ample ability to self-study. That's going to be low on cost and high on time.
Right.
That's typically the trade-off that you're going to get. I work at the far other end of the spectrum, where I work exclusively one-on-one, which is going to be lots of help, lots of self-directed, but a lot higher in cost. The one thing I caution against a little bit is getting caught in the middle and going the prep class option. And having taught some of those myself, a lot of times you have to teach toward the middle of the class. So if you are going to be on the low end of the class or the high end of the class, that's often not a very cost-effective or time-effective method. If you're sort of starting at a 580 and aiming for a 660, a class can be a great option for you. But if you're significantly above or below that, a lot of times that's not as effective as it could be.
So it sort of depends where you are in that range, it sounds like.
Yeah, and again, that's why I said it can be really effective to get some good help early on to get pushed in a right direction.
Sure.
Even if you're going to go it alone after that, to get a good start in the process is huge. And the other thing I'd caution against is your friend who got a really good score is often not a great option to ask about what the best friend is for you. Just because that creates a lot of false expectations of what that process is going to be like for you. And the people who struggle with it typically don't talk about it. So the person the person you've heard from is the person that didn't struggle with this process, and that's maybe not going to set you up as well as you think.
And I frequently tell students that we work with that hiring or working with a coach, for application processes, for testing, is a lot like going to the gym and getting a personal trainer. You can do it on your own, but whoever you're working with is really going to make sure you're doing it correctly, is going to push you to do more reps, is going to be with you through the recovery. And you have to have a tremendous amount of motivation, I think, to work a full day. Many of our students are, traveling a great deal. They're working incredibly long hours and then come home and study for 3 hours or write an essay, and to figure out also how to have a life in the middle of all of this. So it's something that we recognize is, we talk with people all the time that are doing self-study, and I'm like, wow, that really takes a lot of, it takes a lot of strength to do that. And it's more than just sitting down for 12 hours on a Saturday, it's, which also is something else that students tell us they try to do. And I'm like, wow, that's never going to work. You're going to stop retaining after about 2 hours, I'm guessing, or an hour and a half. Here's a terrific question. Joanna, you work with students right when they're coming in to talk with us at Fortuna, and some of them don't have GRE or GMAT scores or EA scores. What do you tell them at that point? And do you want them to start working on application materials prior to that score, or you want them to wait?
Great question. And actually, Judith, I just wanted to offer up one other data point.
Sure, please go ahead. Yes,
conversation, if that's all right. Just because there was a good bit of research that we did when I was at GMAC. We did a pretty extensive survey on an annual basis, but basically the takeaway, and these results were pretty consistent over a decade, were this: that 60% of individuals report that they study on their own for the GMAT. And statistically, there is no difference in score between the candidates who self-prepare versus the candidates who use a prep course or a private tutor. And I think that that's a really powerful statistic, but I always warn people and caution people, it doesn't, it's not an endorsement of any particular study strategy, but I think it's just as a reminder to individuals that they really need to know themselves really well. That's a great way.
That's a great way of putting it. That's a great way of putting it, because you have to have that additional, like, how am I, what's really going to push me? Am I going to push myself? Is someone else going to push me? How does that?
Exactly. And so a lot of self-reflection, a lot of these skills that are going to, that are also going to come in very handy when you're working on your application materials, all factor into this decision as well. But I just wanted to offer that up because I think it's an interesting statistic, and it's certainly one, like I said, that really has not changed much in the last 10 years. So it's held fairly consistent and fairly steady. But with regards to, working on materials concurrently, I always encourage folks that, there are a lot of things that you can be doing to start, to basically, there are a lot of things you can do basically as you're preparing your applications. And kind of to your point, Judith, you can't spend, at some point you're going to reach a point of diminishing returns with regards to exam preparation. And it's important, especially with with that runway, that you're being productive on multiple sort of pieces of your application. I think the one cautionary tale I would say is that, if you have someone, and I've spoken to a lot of folks who, it's the big three, they're like, it's Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, or bust. Oh, by the way, my last practice practice GMAT was a 560. And there's, I think when there's that big of a disconnect between the two, I do think it's important to, to encourage, and what I usually try to do at that point is encourage a little more research on the school front. And I try to take a little bit more of a gentler approach, but it's more of a, is the mentality, is it B school or bust in the next 12 months? Or, if hypothetically, the other pieces of your application don't necessarily align with your school list, are you into waiting a year to strengthen your profile potentially, and usually it's things like the test score, work experience. There are a variety of things that that I'll talk to a prospective client about. But I think all that to say that there are a lot of things that you can be working on. Updating your resume, starting to map out some of those key anchors that are going to help shape your narrative and your story for your application. Thinking through your letter writers. There are a lot of things that you can do on application materials while you are studying for one of the assessments in parallel.
And I definitely tell students when I talk with them, that it's really allowing you to exercise your brain in a lot of different ways, so that attacking it, although it may seem like a lot, it's actually a relief to sit down and do some problems, or a relief to sit down and look at your resume or write, think about why you want to go to business school, right? So either of them can sort of seem like a vacation compared to what you were actually working on at the time. Bill, when you're working with students in your capacity, as a director with us at Fortuna, what are some of the things that you try to understand about the way that they work?
I guess one of the things that's important is, and I think Bryce touched on it, either Bryce or Joanna, I'm not sure, is this whole idea of introspection. Mm-hmm. And I think too few candidates really think long and hard about, who am I? Why do I want to go to business school? What do I want to get out of business school? And what is the right school for me? What's the right fit? And it's not, and too many of them, it's Harvard, Wharton, Stanford, or bust, as Joanna said. So those candidates who are have a good sense of self, or who are willing to sit down and spend the long and sometimes difficult hours to figure out, who am I really, and what is important to me, and how does business school leverage that or supplement potentially some of my weaknesses, are the folks that are in many ways most interesting to work with. Mm-hmm. You can actually sit down with them and help develop a strategy that makes sense given their backgrounds, given their career aspirations, and they're willing to listen to, here's some thoughts of how you position yourself. Here are some thoughts on the schools that might be good fits for you. Now let's go and take a closer look at those schools and what they have to offer, both within the academic programs and the extracurriculars, and begin to really craft an overall application. And then the exam prep will come into that. But I think the more difficult thing for many students is just kind of figure out who they are. I mean, they've typically been good students throughout. They've been good students in high school and college, and they've been successful in their businesses. And perhaps they've never really had to sit down and think through, why am I doing this and what do I have to offer? As opposed to, I'm a good person, I've done well in school, and of course an MBA is the next logical step. It has to go beyond that.
I think it's a great gift. I really do. I wish, I don't have an MBA, but I kind of wish that as a someone more advanced in my career, that I had the opportunity to say, okay, well, how did I get here, and what's going to happen next? I think it's a really wonderful opportunity. And sometimes, this figuring this piece out, as you said, Bill, is so important. That introspection,
right.
And is probably, as much an important part of the process as anything else.
Absolutely.
And than those essays or the preparation for the exams. I am delighted that we've been able to be together this evening. And I'm just going to stop the share for a second and see if there are any questions. There are no open questions. And I think that we had a really, really nice group tonight of folks that are listening in, getting a sense of what we do at Fortuna and at Warwick Strategies. And I really wanted to encourage everybody to reach out to us. If you've got additional questions, we are more than happy to speak with you, share with you a little bit more about our backgrounds. You see all of our information listed on your screen. And we are delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you further about your questions regarding the application processes, and also to tell you more about Bryce at Warwick Strategies, who's been a terrific friend and partner of ours as we go through the application process. So on behalf of myself, Bill, Joanna, and Bryce, thank you again so much for being with us. Hope you guys all have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.